The wind swept across the dust-bitten stretch of ranchland, stirring up tiny cyclones of grit and sage. Overhead, a pair of vultures traced slow, patient circles against the pale afternoon sky. Below them, the land bore scars, a burnt-out homestead, a sagging chicken coop leaning to one side like it was too tired to keep standing, and scattered feathers drifting across the yard like forgotten prayers. From the dirt trail, 5 riders emerged through the heat shimmer. The Beckett gang. Their horses moved at a lazy gait, as if even they knew there was no need to hurry. Smoke still curled from the remains of the farmhouse behind them. They didn't speak, didn't laugh. They'd done what they came to do. Now they were just moving on. The last of them, a squat man with a rope of tobacco tucked in his cheek, glanced back once and spit in the dirt. Behind the coop, nestled in shadow, a battered wooden crate rocked slightly, just once. Then stillness returned. The only sound was the soft clucking of the few chickens that hadn't yet died, pacing in nervous half-circles around the coop, avoiding the crate like it was cursed. Inside it, a girl lay curled into herself, limbs folded like a dying spider. Her skin was the color of old parchment, dry and drawn. 10 years old, perhaps younger, though her eyes had already aged far beyond that. Flies buzzed around the dead chickens that shared her prison, and the stench was thick enough to choke the air. She didn't cry. She had for a while, quiet sobs that faded into whimpers, but now she barely breathed. Her lips were cracked, her cheeks hollow. Only her eyes moved, flicking toward any sound, like an animal still hoping for a crack in the world to escape through. The town had heard the riders come in the night. A few had watched from windows, curtains drawn half an inch. They saw the barn burn. They heard a scream. But by morning, when the smoke thinned and the outlaws had already turned back east, no one stepped forward. They all knew what happened when the Becketts took an interest in something. At the edge of town, a rider approached slowly. His horse was lean, with a dull coat that bore the dust of hard years. The man on its back sat tall, but not proud. His spine was too stiff with old pain. A faded hat shaded his face, but the beard didn't quite hide the years etched into his jawline. One leg hung slightly stiff in the stirrup. A limp man's leg. Elias Rourke. No one knew much about him, only that he kept to himself out near Dead Creek and didn't take kindly to strangers on his land. Some said he used to be something more, law maybe, or worse. But out here, past the last telegraph pole and 100 miles from anyone who cared, the past was whatever you didn't talk about. He reined in near the edge of the chicken coop, dismounted slowly, and looked toward the crate. Something had made a sound, barely more than a breath, but he'd heard it. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe the kind of silence that followed men like the Becketts always left a trail of unease. Either way, he walked to the crate. The smell hit first. Death and waste. Elias pulled the edge of his coat over his mouth and knelt. A few rusted nails held the lid shut. He pulled out a folding knife from his coat and pried it loose, plank by plank. The lid fell away, and sunlight spilled in. She blinked once, not against the light, but in disbelief. The man's shadow fell across her face. He didn't speak right away, just looked at her, long enough to take in the bruises along her collarbone, the tangled hair, the 2 thin arms clutching a chicken's body like it had once been a blanket. "I heard something," he said softly. Didn't know it was someone. From the porch of the general store, a voice called out, "Best leave her, Rourke. That's Beckett business." Elias didn't look back. His eyes stayed locked on the girls. "They left her to die," the voice added. Uneasy, almost a warning. He leaned in and reached carefully, slowly, as if the girl might spook and vanish like mist. She didn't flinch, just stared at him, her expression unreadable. His hands were scarred but gentle as he slipped one arm beneath her shoulders and the other under her legs. She was so light it startled him, like picking up a bundle of bones wrapped in rags. Her head fell against his shoulder, breath shallow. He looked down at her, then at the carcasses around the crate's edge. Then he stood, full weight of her in his arms. "Not today," he said, turning away from the store and the gathering stares. "Not on my land." Someone spat in the dust. Someone else muttered a prayer. But no one stopped him. Elias walked to his horse, still holding the girl. The Mustang stamped and snorted as he adjusted her gently into the saddle, then swung up behind her, slow and stiff. She didn't speak. Her hands trembled against the reins. Elias took them in his own, steady and quiet. He looked once over his shoulder. The general store. The saloon. The dirt street full of people who wouldn't touch a crate with Beckett scent on it. Then he turned his horse, and they rode away. The sun fell behind them like a curtain. The wind carried the scent of ash and old feathers, and the vultures turned elsewhere, disappointed. The road to Elias Rourke's ranch was hardly more than a path, barely carved into the stubborn scrubland that stretched for miles in all directions. The Mustang's hooves struck loose stone and dry soil as they rode in silence, the girl still tucked against Elias's chest, her body so still he checked once or twice to make sure she hadn't slipped away into the wind. When the cabin came into view, it rose not with grandeur, but with grit. Weather-worn logs, a tin roof patched with tar and bark, and a fence that leaned like it had more memories than strength. One mule stood hitched beneath the oak tree, and 2 surviving chickens pecked near the porch, oblivious to the world's cruelty. Elias dismounted and reached for the girl, Lena, as he'd overheard one of the Beckett boys mutter back in town. She didn't protest as he lifted her again and carried her inside. The cabin was a single room, clean but sparse. A wood stove rested cold in the corner. One bed, a rocker, a table with 2 mismatched chairs. Elias set her down on the edge of the bed, fetched a basin of water, and gently wiped her face, the grime coming away in streaks like war paint. She stared at the ceiling the whole time, jaw tight. He didn't ask questions, didn't press her for answers or tears. Instead, he ladled broth from a pot he'd left to simmer that morning. Just vegetables and salt, but warm. He set the bowl beside her and stepped away. She didn't touch it. That night, Elias sat on the porch with his pipe and the stars, listening to the old windmill creak. Inside, she didn't cry. Not once. Days passed like tumbleweeds, slow and without ceremony. Lena rarely spoke. She ate only when he wasn't watching, curled like a fox behind the stove. Elias left food where she could reach it and went about his chores, splitting wood, patching the coop, tending to the mule's hoof. Every few hours, he'd glance at the window to see if she was still there. By the 5th morning, she was standing on the porch when he came back from hauling water. She didn't say anything, just watched him with those sharp, hollow eyes. By the 10th day, she was feeding scraps to the chickens. Then, 2 weeks in, while Elias tightened the saddle on his Mustang, a voice, soft and fragile, broke through the morning air. "Can I feed the horse?" He turned, surprised not by the question, but by the steadiness of it. "Name's Whiskey," he said, and handed her a handful of grain. "He don't like strangers, but he's slow and slow's honest." She smiled barely, just at the corners, and approached the animal with a patience few grown men had. Weeks became routine. Lena swept the porch, helped mend the fence with twine and crooked nails. She began to eat beside Elias at the table, never speaking more than a word or 2 at a time, but she watched him closely, mimicked how he washed his hands or salted his food. Her silences no longer felt empty. They were becoming part of the land itself. One evening, Elias found her in the corner drawer, where old things went to forget. She had a tarnished object in her palm, oval, weathered, once polished to a mirror shine. A U.S. Marshal badge. Her fingers traced the edges, as if learning a secret alphabet. Elias stepped forward, and she looked up at him. Not afraid, but curious. He held her gaze. "That man's long gone," he said. She didn't reply, just placed the badge back in the drawer with gentle care, then closed it. Nothing more was said about it. The neighbors, what few lived scattered across the ridge and gulches, began to whisper again. Saw smoke from Elias's chimney more often. Heard laughter, once, faint and fleeting like a ghost catching its breath. "Rourke's got company," they said. "A girl. Lord knows where she came from. Used to be someone, Rourke, until he vanished. Best leave well enough alone." One night, the sky hung low with thunderclouds. Elias stood by the door, looking out at the ridge that cut across the horizon like the back of some sleeping beast. The first crack of gunfire split the night air. Lena jolted awake in the bed. Elias moved fast, not like a crippled man, but like a wire drawn tight. He reached above the mantel and pulled down the Winchester. Checked the chamber. Loaded 4 shells. Lena stood beside him now, barefoot, eyes wide. "Stay inside," he said, not unkindly. "Who is it?" "Don't know yet." He opened the door slowly, rifle cradled. The wind brought only silence. No more shots. No hoofbeats. Just the rustle of trees and the sound of distant thunder rolling through the canyon. Elias stepped onto the porch, scanning the dark. He didn't return inside until dawn. By morning, nothing remained. No tracks. No voices. Just Elias, eyes bloodshot from a sleepless vigil. Lena poured 2 mugs of coffee, hers mostly milk, his bitter as pine bark. She set his down gently beside his hand, watching him. He looked at her, the sunrise catching his face in gold. "You ever scared?" she asked. He sipped once. "Every day. But you still stay." He nodded. A man don't run just 'cause the wind changes. That morning, she led Whiskey down the trail alone, her shoulders back and chin up, the reins loose in her hand. Elias watched her from the porch, the sun behind him, casting his shadow long across the earth. There were things coming. He could feel it in his bones, same as the cold before a storm. But for now there was peace. Small, stubborn peace. He'd taken her in without asking why. She'd stayed without knowing who he was. That was enough. For now. The peace didn't last. Peace never does on land where blood has been spilled and the law holds no sway. It began with smoke on the horizon, thin and dark, curling above the hills beyond Dry Gulch. Then came the whispers, blown in on the same hot wind that bent the mesquite trees and made the coyotes howl before sunset. The Beckett gang had returned, more vicious than before, swollen in number and meaner in spirit. After months of vanishing into the canyons, they rode back into the territory, like wolves scenting weakness. They burned 2 ranches before sundown, places that had paid them for protection and stopped paying once the gang went quiet. Word traveled fast in the frontier, and rumor traveled faster. By week's end, the Becketts had heard what no outlaw likes to hear. Someone had crossed them. Someone took the girl. A man whispered at a poker table in Larkspur Saloon. "Some old rancher," another said. "Dead Creek way." A third, lowering his voice even more. "They say it was Rourke." The name hung in the air like the smell of gunpowder. Luther Beckett, leader of the gang, wasn't a man who forgave trespasses. Not against his name, and not against his property. Even if that property had been a half-dead girl locked in a crate. He tipped his chair back, laughed once, and said, "Well, then we ride at dawn." The knock on Elias's door came 2 days later. 3 raps, slow and deliberate. The kind of knock that didn't ask for permission, just time. Elias opened it to find Sheriff Bramley, standing on the porch, hat in hand, dust coating his boots up to the knee. "Elias," he said, not unkindly, "can we talk?" They sat at the table. Lena watched from the corner, silent as always, hands in her lap. The fire in the stove popped, sending little sparks into the darkening room. "The Becketts know," the sheriff began. "About her. About you." Elias didn't flinch. "They're already back on this side of the ridge," Bramley continued. "They hit Jensen's farm last night, torched the barn, left his dog strung up." Lena stiffened. Elias reached for his coffee and took a slow sip. "You know what they'll do," Bramley said. "You're not just protecting a child. You're making a statement. And men like Luther Beckett, they don't let statements stand." Elias looked at the sheriff with the same calm that came just before a thunderclap. "I don't dine with devils," he said. Bramley sighed. "Then I hope to God you still shoot like you used to." That night, the cabin was quiet. Even the mule outside didn't bray, and the chickens huddled without clucking. The sky above was cloudless, but the wind spoke of something waiting just past the ridge. Lena sat at the table, working through a tin plate of beans. Elias was at the workbench, the lamp casting long shadows across the room. She watched as he unwrapped a bundle of oiled cloth and revealed his rifle, a long, beautifully worn Winchester with a silver inlay along the stock. Not flashy, just proud. He cleaned each piece with methodical care, fingers steady, face unreadable. "Is that the one you used before?" she asked. He didn't look up. "It is. You were a lawman?" He paused for a long beat, then nodded once. "And I still am. Just don't wear the badge no more." Lena thought on that. Then she rose, crossed the room, and stood beside him. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. They stood that way a while, two people who had been left behind by the world, finding shelter in the small space between silence and truth. The next morning broke with a heat already heavy on the land. Elias stepped outside to fetch water from the well, and stopped dead in his tracks. His barn door was blackened and blistered, the wood charred. Someone had taken a branding iron to it, burning a single message deep into the planks. "She's ours." The letters were jagged, uneven, scorched into the wood like the promise of a noose. Elias stared at it for a long moment, then walked back into the cabin. He poured himself coffee, sipped once, and waited. Lena came out minutes later, rubbing her eyes. She saw the look on his face and followed him outside. When her gaze met the words, she stiffened, but didn't cry. Elias knelt beside the pile of lumber near the fence, took 2 boards and some nails. Quietly, he climbed a ladder and hammered a new panel over the scorched message. When he was done, he turned to her. She was watching him with those wide, stormy eyes. He dusted off his hands and said, calm as sunrise, "You eat at my table now." She nodded once, throat tight. "That means something," he added. She looked at the barn one last time, then back at Elias. And this time, she was the one who walked inside first, standing a little taller, the door swinging shut behind her like punctuation. The wind came first, low, dry, and carrying the scent of dust and smoke. It whispered through the canyon, like a warning too late to matter. As dusk bled into full dark, Elias moved with slow purpose across the yard of his ranch. The sun was gone now, swallowed behind the ridgeline, leaving only the pale breath of lanterns flickering at the corners of the barn and porch. Each one had been rigged with wire to swing just slightly, casting shadows that danced and misled. Cattle bells hung from fence posts and old wagon wheels, strung like wind chimes meant not to sing, but to betray motion. Buckets filled with sand were scattered through the brush, softening Elias's own steps. Every detail of the trap was thought through, honed quiet. Inside the cabin, Lena crouched in the root cellar, door latched above her. In her hand she held Elias's old badge, cool metal against her palm, edges worn smooth from years in a drawer. Her breathing was steady, but her fingers trembled. She was ready to be brave. Elias had asked for that much. Above her, the world held its breath. Then the thunder of hooves shattered the stillness. The Becketts came in with the swagger of men too long unchallenged. 7 of them, faces smeared with dust, teeth yellow with cruelty, and torches in hand like devils come to claim a soul. "Rourke!" One of them bellowed as they rode into the yard. "Come on out, you dried-up ghost. Time to hand over what's ours." From the shadow of the barn, Elias moved like smoke. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. A torch lifted toward the cabin, and the first bell rang. A sharp clang, unexpected. One outlaw turned, just in time to see Elias rise from the brush, rifle raised. A shot cracked through the night. Clean. Measured. The outlaw dropped like a sack of wet grain, his torch falling into the dirt with a hiss. The horses panicked, rearing. Elias vanished back into the dark. A second man dismounted, shouting, firing blindly into the trees. Another clang, this time from the porch, and a lantern swung wide, throwing light behind him. A shadow shifted. Another shot. Another outlaw down. The remaining 5 scattered, looking for cover. But the yard was no longer their domain. It was Elias's, mapped out in his mind, built with every trap, every hiding place, every echo of the land he'd lived on for years. A third fell behind the coop, tripping a tripwire that swung a lantern and exposed him in a spotlight of flame. The fourth took a step back and triggered a loose bell hanging under the water trough. That hesitation cost him his life. The fifth ran for the barn and made it to the doorway, only to find Elias waiting inside. No shot fired, just the crack of a rifle but across the temple. A clean, brutal silence. Now only 2 remained, a lanky, nervous rider circling wide, and Luther Beckett himself, riding tall in the saddle, grinning like the devil. Luther dismounted with the calm of a man who had never once believed he could lose. His torch flickered in one hand. In the other, he held a thick stick of dynamite, its fuse already lit. "Come on out, lawman," Luther called. "Ain't no need to finish this with shadows and whispers. Let's see if you're still as fast as the stories say." From the darkness near the porch, Elias stepped forward. He wasn't hiding anymore. Lantern light hit his face, and for the first time, Luther Beckett saw the fire behind the calm. Not rage, something colder, something older. A man who had been fast long before fear had names. "Put it down," Elias said. Luther just laughed, the fuse hissing shorter in his hand. "You've had your fun, Rourke, but you forgot how this game ends." Elias didn't speak again. He just moved. The sound of the shot was a whisper compared to the roar it stopped. The bullet clipped the fuse clean off, a spark flicking harmlessly into the dirt. Before Luther could react, the second shot came, this one punching the revolver from his hand. The third wasn't fired. Elias walked forward and cracked the rifle's stock across Luther's wrist, knocking the dynamite loose. Luther stumbled back, howling, "You damn relic." Elias kicked his legs out and pinned him against a fence post. In moments, the outlaw was bound with rawhide, wrists behind his back, face in the dirt. The last rider, the lanky one, had already fled into the hills, hoofbeats fading fast. Elias stood over Luther, rifle lowered. "You'll face a court this time," he said. "I'm done burying justice in the dirt." Morning came slow over the horizon, brushing the ranch in gold. Lena climbed from the cellar and stood at the door, badge still in her hand. The yard was quiet. Elias stood beside the barn, smoke curling from his pipe, watching as the sheriff's posse arrived to collect the bodies, and the man tied to a post like a trophy. Lena walked to him. He glanced down, saw the badge in her hand. She looked up at him and asked, "Does this mean you're a lawman again?" He took the badge from her, thumbed the edge. "Never stopped," he said softly, and for the first time, she smiled without fear. Morning settled slow over Dead Creek, bathing the land in a soft gold that made even the worn wood of Elias's ranch glow with quiet dignity. Smoke lifted from the chimney in a single, steady line. The air was clean, still, as if holding its breath after the storm. Sheriff Bramley arrived with a dozen riders at his back, rifles slung but unused. They expected wreckage, gunfire, maybe a grave or two. What they found instead made them pull their hats off and sit their horses in reverent silence. The barn stood blackened but standing. The bodies of 6 outlaws lay covered in tarp, marked and ready for burial, and tied to a fence post near the chicken coop. Hands bound, bruised but breathing, sat Luther Beckett himself. The man who'd terrorized half the county now had a bloodied lip and a swelling eye, and a look in his face that had lost all bite. Sheriff Bramley dismounted slowly and looked at Elias, who stood with a cup of coffee in one hand and his rifle leaning beside the porch. "You did what 10 of us couldn't," Bramley said. Elias gave a small shrug. "Didn't do it for you." Bramley nodded once, then looked around. "Where's the girl?" At that moment, the door creaked open and Lena stepped out. She wore a simple dress now, one the widow Jensen had mended. Her hair had been washed and braided, her cheeks pink from sleep and sun. She looked like any other child her age, until her eyes met Bramley's. She didn't hide, didn't flinch. "She's safe now," Elias said. Bramley gave her a nod of respect. "You're lucky, miss. Not many folk come back from where you've been." Lena tilted her chin slightly upward. "I wasn't lucky," she said. "He came." By noon, word had traveled faster than the sheriff's posse. Wagons began arriving down the dusty trail. Farmers, ranchers, wives with baskets wrapped in linen. They came in small clusters, offering tools, fence posts, seed, chickens, and quiet words. "We heard what you did. God bless you, Rourke. Wish I'd had your spine 10 years ago." Elias didn't say much, just nodded and made space for them to leave what they brought. Lena stood at his side through it all, taking it in with wide eyes. For a girl who had been left in a crate like garbage, the sudden attention seemed as strange as snow in summer. But she didn't shrink from it. She stood tall, one hand resting on Whiskey's bridle, the other never straying far from Elias. The town had looked the other way when she needed them most. Now they came with offerings they hoped would make peace with the part of themselves they had lost. A week passed, then another. Fences were mended. The barn replanked. Chickens doubled. Whiskey even seemed to walk with more pride, with Lena riding bareback through the canyon trails like she'd been born there. On the third Sunday after the showdown, Elias took her into town. She rode ahead of him on Whiskey, smiling without restraint as they passed the general store, the saloon, the church. Children waved. Women offered pie. Even the men tipped their hats. No one said it, but everyone knew. The girl who had been left to die was now a symbol of what they almost lost, and what a single man had been willing to protect. Outside the post office, a man in a bowler hat with a notebook tucked under his arm stepped forward. His suit was clean, too clean for a place like this. He pushed his glasses up and looked from Lena to Elias. "Excuse me, sir," he said, voice clipped and Eastern. "Name's Malcolm Crane. I write for the San Francisco Standard. I believe I recognize you." Elias didn't stop walking. The man hurried alongside. "You Marshal Elias Rourke," he pressed. "The one who vanished after the Rust River Massacre." At that, Elias paused. He looked at the man fully, eyes cool and flat as lake water. "There's no glory in ghosts," Elias said. "I just did what was right." Crane hesitated, unsure whether to write that down. Then Elias walked on. Lena looked back at the reporter and smiled, just slightly. The kind of smile that said some things couldn't be printed on paper. That night, the table in Elias's cabin was set for two. It was old, scarred with years of hard elbows and knife marks, but tonight it gleamed with polish. A fresh cloth covered it, stitched by a neighbor, gifted without a word. The plates were warm, the stew thick with vegetables grown from borrowed seeds and rainwater hope. Lena set the bowls down herself, proud, hand steady. Her hair was braided again, her cheeks full. She laughed as she sat, the sound easy, unforced. Elias folded his napkin in his lap, cleared his throat, and lifted a mug toward her. "To another day," he said. Lena tapped her mug against his. "To our table." Outside, the wind stirred softly through the grass. The chickens rustled in the coop. The mule snored. And somewhere in the distance, the last echoes of the Becketts faded into memory.